60% mental and 40% physical.
Math was never our strong suit, but breaking down Ohio State football is. Sit back and join us for BuckeyeGrove Instant Access, part of the Unscripted Ohio Podcast Network.
You can do it!
Brought to you by BuckeyeGrove.com. Post-game thoughts, immediate analysis, and much, much more to put the big game into perspective. Without any further delay of game, here's your host, Kevin Noon.
Kevin, goddammit.
Welcome to the BIA podcast. That is your BuckeyeGrove Instant Access podcast. It is Tuesday. It'll be Tuesday afternoon by the time I get this thing posted. And what a Tuesday it is. I'm back home finally. Been on the road for a couple weeks covering recruiting for Southern Swing. We're going to have a big official visit weekend coming up starting in June. But there's still plenty going on right now. We're just on the heels of the 2021 NFL draft. Still kind of breaking that down. Of course, we want to talk about 2022 because never can just let sleeping dogs lie at that point. So we will talk about that as well. But I want to bring in our great team writer, Griffin Strom, who has been covering the draft for us, not only the 21, but looking ahead to 22. Griffin, how are things going?
Oh, it's going great over here, Kevin. Thanks so much for having me on. It's been quite a while since I've dusted off the podcast cords, so to speak. And really just, every time you think there's going to be a little bit of lull in Buckeye news or anything like that, there's always, something else to talk about. So there's been plenty of action here in the last couple of days for us to go over today.
Exactly. We could probably either do an hour-long podcast or 3 or 4 podcasts over the span of a day. I'm going to try and segment this one out just to be about the NFL draft. We're going to try and come back later this week with some other stuff. We really haven't even put a bow on the spring game, to be quite honest. So that's coming up, and maybe some other things. But first and foremost, the 2021 draft is in the books, and a bit of a mixed bag. We certainly saw players, I think, slide further than we expected. We saw maybe a couple go a little higher than expected. But a good handful of players now know their NFL teams. Several others are going the undrafted free agent route, and it's just going to be a matter of being able to make those teams. But, somebody who's certainly going to make his team is going to be quarterback Justin Fields, going number 11 overall to the Chicago Bears. But oh my goodness, what a journey that all was, with just the information slash disinformation tour that was out there, information going out about his own, health, about dealing with epilepsy, just, one of the more unique and just odd draft processes that I can remember.
Yeah, 100%. All the narratives, we've talked about it really ad nauseum, and even to the point where, I'm kind of sitting there during some of these, media availabilities, interviews of Justin Fields, and thinking, like, is he more annoyed answering questions about, all the criticisms than he even was by the criticisms themselves itself? But, you had, guys like Chris Sims, obviously, that was a big deal. Him putting Fields at like number 32 on his mock draft. Some people thought Fields was going to slide all the way down to, 15, go to the Patriots perhaps. But I think in the end, it really wasn't, we obviously knew he wasn't going to be, a top 2 pick. Like I think a lot of us thought he might be, last year at this time or something like that. But given that we knew that he wasn't going to go probably in the top 2, and probably, we heard the report earlier in the week that the 49ers had kind of, narrowed it down between Trey Lance and Mac Jones. So at that point, you're figuring Fields is probably not going to go in the top 3 picks. And considering that, I don't think 11 is a too crazy of a slide, considering, all the criticisms we heard and how it could have gone if some of those, if teams were really believing into some of those narratives, about not being a great leader, not working hard enough, not loving the game enough, and this, that, and the third. All things considered, I think you still saw that, a team like the Chicago Bears was willing to give up some draft picks and trade up and get Fields. And I've really seen only universal praise from really the Bears, fan base and things of that nature. I think people are really excited on the Bears end about what Fields can bring to the table. And obviously, us having watched Fields the past couple of years, I think we would tend to agree with, the high ceiling that he might have if things kind of go his way in that system.
And we've heard, after the fact that, I think it was somebody through NFL Network said that about a quarter of the teams, give or take, had Fields as the number one quarterback on their board. Number one, even ahead of, does that mean Trevor Lawrence? And then you wonder, okay, well, if that's true and Fields slides all the way to 11, so through 33% of the draft, and a quarter of the teams feel this, and all those teams that generally are drafting behind Chicago at that point are probably pretty good teams. Should we read into that a little bit? I mean, you're drafting at the top generally for a reason. It's something that I think that people will talk about for a long time, but thankfully we're not going to have to talk about it week in and week out now that it's done. I mean, I think everybody will be interested to see what Fields looks like in Chicago. He will be, we'll presume that he'll be the understudy to Andy Dalton, at least at the start of the season. Whether or not it's Andy Dalton for the whole year and Fields learning, or Fields comes in game 5, game 7, whatever, a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, I honestly think for Fields, just because of all the pre-draft scrutiny and all the storylines and criticisms, I think the best thing for him would probably be to, kind of let some of that stuff, sink, to not being, these big headline grabbing, narratives anymore. Like, let the season play out a little bit, have Andy Dalton go out there and be the starter, let Fields kind of develop, behind the scenes. And that way, because, you could imagine if he goes out there and starts week 1, with his name kind of being this hot button issue before the draft, how much scrutiny that's going to, attract, how much attention it's going to attract. I mean, it still will, even, if he ends up starting halfway through the season, or, even not this season or the next season. But I think it would be best for him to kind of develop a little bit, just to let kind of those headlines die down a little bit.
Moving on in the draft, and I think if we fast forward 5 years into the future, people will not get this trivia question right. And that question would be, behind Justin Fields, who was the second Buckeye taken off the board? And people are going to look and see All-Americans like Wyatt Davis, certainly all-conference type of performers, and defensive back of the year within the Big Ten, Shaun Wade. How many people do you think are going to sit there and really think that it was Pete Werner going number 60 overall, late second round, to the New Orleans New Orleans Saints, a team that just seems to really like taking Ohio State players?
Yeah, I mean, especially like if you talk to an Ohio State fan or spectator or anybody after, coming off of the 2018 season, and telling them that Pete Werner was going to be, drafted, the second Buckeye drafted, just a couple years later. I don't think a lot of people would have believed you, but I think, Pete Werner definitely, turned a lot of heads with some of those pro day kind of measurables, with him having, almost a 40-inch vertical leap and things of that nature, which, how much is a pure vertical leap really translate, to the NFL game and things of that nature. But still, like, I don't think a lot of people would have thought that Pete Werner had kind of that pure athleticism that would translate to those type of numbers and those type of, combine drills. And we had heard rumblings that he was kind of climbing up draft boards, but I still didn't think that he was going to end up being the second Buckeye after Fields taken. I thought, Wyatt Davis was gonna probably be the second Buckeye taken, just, from looking at a lot of mock drafts and how he had been, considered for just the last couple of years, him being an all decade, Big Ten, offensive guard and things of that nature. But instead it was Werner. And then, even after that, you go to Josh Myers even before Wyatt Davis got drafted. But yeah, Pete Werner, obviously, a very impressive, rise up the draft boards, and a big storyline for him coming out of this weekend.
You're listening to the BIA podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Noon, joined by Griffin Strom, and we are talking 2021 NFL draft. And back to Werner, yeah, you look at him, and there was certainly, criticism of the entire linebacker core at Ohio State within Buckeye Nation, but you do talk about the the vertical leap, and basically, a lot of numbers that show explosion. And you look at Warner and you're like, I don't know if I see that there. But then you realize that he was somebody who was very much a Swiss Army knife within the Ohio State defense. He was able to do, to fill a lot of roles. I mean, he single-handedly derailed the bullet. I mean, they were talking up the bullet, and then Pete Werner just never left the field. So, yeah, that's going to be an interesting fit to see how that works, because I think that Sean Payton and his staff are going to be able to plug Werner in one of several different positions potentially. And then, as you said, Josh Myers, he went 2 picks later to Green Bay. He will step into the role vacated by Corey Linsley, who now is with Seattle. I'm not even sure. I can't even keep track of all the offseason movement. Another player that I thought potentially could have been the second Buckeye off the board, just based on a lot of the post-pro day chatter, was Baron Browning, and he doesn't go off until in the 3rd round, 105. But a couple other Buckeyes before him, Wyatt Davis going 86th to Minnesota, and then Trey Sermon 88th to San Francisco. So between Davis, Sermon, and Browning, a lot to talk about there.
Yeah, and I'm sitting there during the draft, hitting publish on our, draft stories and whatnot. And I was thinking, like, my finger was hovering on the trigger when it comes to, a Baron Browning, considerably earlier than he ended up going. He ended up going, I think, with the final pick of, day 2 on that Friday. So pretty late on Friday night. I thought he would go a little bit earlier than that. I thought he would go closer to Pete Werner, not 45 picks later, or because I thought that those guys would be kind of more neck and neck. But I think you also saw from Pete Werner probably more of a polished, productive linebacker product for longer stretches of time, I think, at Ohio State. Obviously they both Browning switched to replace Werner at that, Sam outside position this year. But Werner had, a ton of tackle, led the team in tackles this year from that inside position. Just kind of interesting to see where those guys ended up falling. And yeah, like you said, Browning just obviously with the freakish athleticism, and that stuff really translates to the obviously the NFL side of things. But yeah, Trey Sermon, a lot of these guys were really pegged. They could have gone anywhere round 3, 4, 5 ish. So I was expecting Sermon maybe to even fall a little bit more than he ended up going, because he ended up going there only 2 picks after Wyatt Davis at 88 overall. And you get Trey Sermon pairing up with Trey Lance there in San Francisco. So that'll be an exciting kind of offense to watch coming in there. And it'll be interesting to see, can Trey Sermon come in and have an impact right away? Do we see, Sermon translate what he was able to do with Ohio State at the end of this past season, or will it be more of a kind of a transition for him, given the fact that it was inconsistent for him at times at Ohio State? It took him a while to get going. That'll be a very interesting storyline to watch for him. And yeah, when it comes to Wyatt Davis, I'm just surprised Wyatt Davis fell, all the way down to pick number 86 in round 3, because I think, last year at this time, a lot of people had Wyatt Davis slated as, a late first round pick. I think his 2019 season was kind of more acclaimed than his 2020 season. But we also heard from Wyatt Davis after the season that he played half of the season with a pretty serious knee injury. And he still started every game for Ohio State this season. I think he was the only offensive lineman, maybe him and Mumford, if I'm not mistaken, might have been the only 2 players to actually start every game for Ohio State this season, even though Davis obviously ended up having to come out of the national championship game with an injury. But I wonder how much that injury kind of played on the minds of NFL scouts and talent evaluators and coaches and whatnot, to kind of allow for that slide to happen, because I did think that Wyatt Davis I thought he would be the first offensive lineman taken. I thought he would be taken over Myers, and I thought he would go a little bit higher.
And then 4 last Buckeyes were taken, with Cleveland Browns taking Tommy Togiai, a player that had some eligibility left, but opted to go to the draft, going 132. Urban Meyer's Jacksonville Jaguars takes Luke Farrell at 145 at tight end. Then I think one of the most polarizing picks of the draft, you have Shaun Wade going to Baltimore at 160. A player that certainly had a first round grade probably before the season, and then I think he fell even further than I expected. I kind of expected him to go in the fourth, and then the final Buckeye who was drafted, Jonathan Cooper, 239 to Denver. All sorts of little storylines there as we hit those in rapid fire fashion.
Yeah, so starting off there with Luke Farrell, he didn't even appear on most mock drafts. I did our little Buckeyes mock draft tracker, and the 5 that I used for that story, Luke Farrell did not appear drafted on any of those 5. So to see him picked at all, and not even picked at all, but picked with the first pick of the 5th round, and of course going to Urban Meyer with Jacksonville, the first and only Buckeye he selected in the draft. That was just a great storyline. Obviously a little clip on social media of their interaction. That's all great stuff. So that was very interesting. The Shaun Wade thing is really, you really have to feel bad for that whole situation because, there were times when, Shaun Wade, that people thought he might go, as a mid first round pick. They thought he might go, 15 or even higher than that maybe, at certain times, maybe at this time last year when people were projecting ahead. And the fact that, his own, dad was kind of, at the head of the campaign to make the Big Ten season happen after they had canceled it initially, when Shaun Wade could have just sat out and gone pro and probably gotten drafted a lot higher than he ended up. What gets me about that really is that even though Shaun Wade struggled on the outside of the season, it's not like he showed it's not like his ability to play that slot cornerback position got any worse from his struggles on the outside. So you kind of wonder okay, well, if he was already, projected to go quite high, having only played in the slot before this past season, why does he then slide so far down? You know what I mean? After moving over to the outside. But yeah, then, nice to see a Coop get drafted there in round 7. I kind of thought that Justin Hilliard or either Tuff Borland or Justin Hilliard might sneak in the draft, guys with a ton of experience, years and years in that Ohio State program. But neither of those guys did. I was kind of focused on the storyline of maybe 3 or 4 Ohio State linebackers could get drafted in this draft, but instead just those 2 with Werner and Browning ended up going.
Right, and then just jumping back in on Tommy Togiai, I think a lot of people were surprised when he decided to go to the draft, and Haskell Garrett decides to come back. Probably saw that being flipped around. It really, he is a player that I think once he puts it all together could be pretty remarkable. Certainly has the strength. He made a run at the bench press record. It came up a little short there, but as somebody who doesn't have a dog in the fight in terms of this whole AFC North situation and living here right in a critical mass in Columbus, and I have Browns friends. I've got Bengals friends. I even have a couple Steelers friends. Not many Ravens friends. But I know that that it was always something that Browns fans lamented, that the Browns were not in on the in-state school in terms of Ohio State. But good to see them drafting a Buckeye.
Yeah, and I think Togiai might be considered a little bit undersized, I guess, for that tackle position at the NFL level. But obviously, as that strength kind of makes up for that, and I think he probably would have liked to have gone maybe in that 3rd round. Because he came out a year early. I think a lot of people think he probably could have benefited from coming back, given that this past year was his first year as a starter. But he still gets picked pretty early in the 4th round, and to go to the Browns, it was a pretty nice situation for him.
So there you have it. I got one last question, then we'll take a quick break and talk about 2022 moving ahead. But how will you remember this draft? Was this a successful draft class for Ohio State? Obviously they did not have the type of top end that like an Alabama had. But, once again, we're looking at just a ton of Buckeyes getting drafted. And I think when you sit there and you look at all the players that return in 22, that I think it's going to be remembered as a pretty good draft, even if it was a little heavier in the middle than 2020, where they had 3 1s, a 2, and 3 3s, or even 2019 where they had a couple of 1s, a 2, and a couple of 3s. A little bit more in the middle, but I think a good class nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, it's still. I think it's only the eighth time that they've had a double-digit players selected in a draft. I think it's tied for the seventh most players ever selected in a draft for Ohio State with 10. And as we mentioned, Alabama, they obviously had a lot. It was a much more top-heavy draft class for Alabama. But those two programs had tied for the most players selected this year with 10. So when you look at it from that angle, I mean, still an extremely successful draft for Ohio State, even if getting 10 players drafted, these days for Ohio State, is more of like an expectation than something to be, super excited about, considering, the talent that this program just lands, year in and year out these days. But yeah, I think, even though it kind of got slow on day two for a while there, but in the end, it was another very deep class for Ohio State. And, with all the attention going to Fields, in the first round anyway, I think they were well represented in the draft.
Yeah, I definitely agree there. It was a weird draft for me being on the road for Southern Swing. I listened to most of it on the radio, and you think it's annoying watching the draft and not hearing the picks because they're doing interviews and laughing and everything else on TV. Try listening to it on the radio. Let me tell you. About the best thing I had going was that my phone would buzz whenever Griffin would publish a story, or one of our former interns, Jacob or Marcus, with an Ohio State player being drafted. And at least at that point, I knew I needed to listen closer to the radio because somebody was coming off the board. But certainly not the way that I want to consume the draft moving forward. But speaking of moving forward, we're moving forward. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll talk 2022 here in just a couple of seconds. Egg Water Conditioning has been treating well in city water in Central Ohio with American-made water filtration products for over 60 years. Have a water quality problem? The water treatment experts at Hague know how to solve it. Not sure if your water softener is working? They will test, inspect, and sanitize any brand of water softener for only $20. Schedule a system checkup or water test today by calling 614-836-2195 or visit them online at HagueH2O.com. That's HAGUE H2O.com. Welcome back to the BI Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Noon, joined by Griffin Strom. We are talking NFL draft. We have talked for about 20 minutes about the 2021 draft, and we'll talk for a couple minutes here about some projections in terms of the 2022 draft. And we're 60 days away from it. We got a ways to go. We certainly have seen players that have played themselves up into a 1 or 2, into a 2, or players that we were talking about as a 1 or 2, maybe falling down to a 4th or 5th round pick. So, this is all in good fun, kind of talking about this. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what the season's going to hold in store, who could move up. But, Griffin took the time this morning to put out a projections piece where he looked at several of these way too early drafts and kind of put some things in perspective. And, instead of me just kind of regurgitating the piece for everybody, I urge everybody to take a look at it. What were some of the biggest takeaways you had as you were putting the piece together?
Honestly, I think the biggest kind of double take that I had when looking at these was how high Sevyn Banks is projected across the board in all 5 of the ones that I used for the piece. He goes between number 8 overall to no lower than number 17 overall in the 5 way too early mock drafts I looked at, which, I mean, Sevyn Banks absolutely has all, the physical tools, the size, he's like 6'1", 6'2", 200 pounds. If you just look at him, he obviously is an NFL caliber, athlete. And I think all of the measurables and whatnot will end up showing that also, during the pre-draft process. But I think a lot of Ohio State fans, having just watched one season of him starting on that, kind of flawed secondary last year, would kind of be thinking to themselves like, man, like he's getting like that type of universal, acclaim as a potential, high first round pick. I think that surprised me quite a bit, honestly. And then beyond that, Zach Harrison's getting a lot of love as a first round pick too, which obviously that is his, we've all known that that's his ceiling, is to be that type of first round NFL draftee. But have we seen him put it all together on the field yet for long stretches where he's been, really lived up to, that 5-star potential and that upper that Bosa brother, Chase Young, pass rushing ability. I don't think we have seen that quite yet. So I think those are two guys that, those are some projections that I think those guys are going to have to play their way into that. I don't think that those guys are going to get drafted that high if the draft happened right now, or if they opted out for a season. Because I just don't know. Maybe they would. I don't know. But I don't know if I've seen enough actually on the field from those in terms of like actual on field production, on tape, to warrant them going quite that high. And maybe I'm sounding skeptical here on that. But I think, it might take, a breakout season for those guys to get that status. I don't know. What are your thoughts on those two guys?
Yeah, I was, when I looked at the piece, I was a little surprised that they had Banks that high. I certainly think he has a lot of potential. He certainly has the physical skills. What will that secondary look like when they have, they've had 15 full practices for spring football. They'll have, barring something crazy happening, a full summer, a full fall, and then certainly anywhere from a 12 to 15 game season to put it together. So it's certainly there for the taking for Banks. And we also have seen just the run on corners that happen. I mean, it's year in and year out. It's not, this corner class was, significantly better than that corner class. It's a matter of we need to grab corners when we can, because you end up with your top cut, and then the gap between that top cut and the second cut sometimes can be pretty drastic. As for Zach Harrison, yeah, I think there's a lot of hope out there in terms of Buckeye Nation and NFL executives that this is the year Harrison puts it together. I mean, sometimes it does take until year 3 for it. Will like the emergence of hopeful emergence of Jack Sawyer certainly help things out? Will Zach Harrison get enough reps out there? I mean, Larry Johnson certainly keeps the reps at very manageable numbers. That sounds great in practice. I mean, you certainly have fresh guys come the fourth quarter, but are you allowing guys, to sit there and be able to get enough reps to be impactful? So, I don't know. I think both of those are very good points. I think one thing that didn't surprise me is the tandem of Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson, certainly as first rounders. Olave shocking many by coming back. Wilson didn't have a choice as a second-year player. This will be his third year and undoubtedly his final year with the Buckeyes. But, another couple of guys that are cemented across the lines more or less in terms of being first-rounders.
Yeah, and those would be the first pair of first-round Ohio State wide receiver draftees since the 2007 draft with, of course, Ted Ginn Jr. and Anthony Gonzalez. So that's kind of an interesting note. And that's also the last time an Ohio State wide receiver was drafted in the first round in general. And, a lot of people think that they're going to have 2 of them this year. Olave going as high as number 5 on Yahoo Sports, number 5 overall, of course. Garrett Wilson did not make the Yahoo Sports mock draft, which was just 1 round. However, I think a lot of people would favor him to get up there, after another season. If those guys, and of course the quarterback change is going to be a big factor in this. But, those guys could have just put up absurd, season totals in terms of statistics this past season, with both of them basically averaging 100 yards a game, just eating up so many targets in the Ohio State pass attack, leaving a lot of other guys, to wish that they had some their way. But yeah, that was kind of the least surprising thing about the mock drafts here. And then you kind of get kind of a mixed bag after those 4 guys that we just talked about. With, I think a lot of these mock drafts, how well researched are some of them, because you've got a guy like Thayer Munford that's going in the first round of the Yahoo Sports mock draft, but then he doesn't show up in any of the other 4 mock drafts, even some that went beyond 1 or 2 rounds. So that's kind of interesting. 3 different Ohio State offensive linemen showed up in the first 2 rounds of a couple of these mock drafts. So Thayer Munford, NPF Nicholas Petit-Ferrer showed up in the second round of the Pro Football Network mock drafts, but no other mock drafts there out of those 5. And then Harry Miller showed up in another one as well. So that'll all be interesting. I think Thayer Munford, honestly, that seems like a pretty safe bet to me for not necessarily a first round lock or anything, but just a guy that's definitely, a pretty, guaranteed solid type of, prospect at the next level. Just the longevity he's been able to hold down that left tackle post for Ohio State and just play at such a high level. And you saw last year what he can do when he's not hampered by, a lingering back issue. And I think he'll further show that, this coming year, his final year, his 5th year with Ohio State.
And then finally in there, you have Teron Vincent making the draft boards for NBC Sports as a first rounder. And for the last lines, I'm not sure which that one is, as a second rounder. Another player that we certainly have seen, some flashes. Maybe we haven't seen the consistency yet, but the thing is when you're doing these way too early mock drafts 360 days beforehand, you got to go out on some flyers, and I certainly feel that one's a little bit of a flyer right now.
Yeah, I mean, that's a former 5-star guy, right? And his career at Ohio State so far has really been hampered by a torn labrum that took a lot of time out of his development. And last year, I think towards the end of the year, he really got he was really gaining traction and gaining confidence, playing with a lot of attitude. And I think a lot of people are expecting, big things out of him as well. We've heard his name, with the coaching staff, with Larry Johnson. I think, even maybe Ryan Day was talking about, Teron Vincent as being a guy that's really putting it together this offseason on that defensive line. And, they'll need him to without, Tommy Togiai, whether or not he's actually playing that nose position or not. But there is that vacancy there. So he will have, theoretically a lot more time this year on that defensive line, and could make a drastic rise in the draft.
Overall, talking 21, 22, I mean, just your thoughts about Ohio State and its ability to produce players for the NFL. I mean, I know that that's kind of the broadest question abroad, but I think that's the best way that we can bring this all together. When you sit there and you see a year where Ohio State makes it to the championship game, only has 1 first rounder. We're sitting here now looking at the 22 early drafts. I mean, we've got several of these mock drafts with 4 or 5 players tentatively slated as first rounders, and we know that's always going to change as things emerge. But Ohio State certainly loves playing that developed here card, and have no reason to say that they shouldn't, based on just what their draft output has been here over the last 20 years.
Yeah, for sure. And I would just sum it up kind of by saying that, it's really no surprise at this point, the level at which they've been able to, just keep pumping out talent, top tier talent to the NFL. Obviously, we look at these way too early projections right now. It seems like Ohio State might have, a higher number of first round guys go next year. But of course, we also mentioned before that it might take a big year for a couple of those guys to actually launch themselves into that, stratosphere when all is said and done. But yeah, and that's what Ohio State Ohio State, if you're competing with Alabama, on the actual college football field, in the world of recruiting, in the world of, just NFL draft selections, I mean, if they're going to compete with, the Alabamas of the world, then they kind of have to do that, so it is kind of an expectation for them. And, competing with these schools for whether it be, DBU, QBU, all of those things, a huge part of that is what those guys end up doing at the next level, and the professional success that these guys have. That plays a big role in recruiting and landing these top guys that know that they can be developed into top tier NFL talent when they go to your program.
And there you have it. So we have put the draft to bed. I'm sure we'll talk about it some here and there as time goes on, but an interesting weekend for the Buckeyes in 21, a lot to look forward to in 22. I want to thank Griffin for joining us. We will definitely reconvene later this week to talk some other things like Ohio State spring practice being in the books here now for a couple of weeks and some other things. But Griffin, thanks for being part of the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I look forward to hopping back on here in a few days.
Absolutely. And I want to thank everybody out there for listening to us here for about 35 minutes. So it's time for us to go. We will be back later this week. It's the BIA podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Noon. Thanks for listening.
Be sure to stay up to date with BuckeyeGrove Instant Access when the news breaks or after the big game. Exclusively at BuckeyeGrove.com or anytime on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher as part of the Unscripted Ohio Podcasts Network. Hit that subscribe button so you can stay in the know and never miss a single episode.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to click on that subscribe button so you don't miss a single thing, and come visit us over at BuckeyeGrove.com for all the best Ohio State information on the web.